Hey everyone. Tonight we don't begin in a battlefield or a king's chamber, but in a spotless German laboratory in 1898. Here, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann believed he'd cured pain itself. In a glass vial sat a clear, golden liquid, smoother than morphine, cleaner than opium. They called it heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic. Doctors prescribed it to mothers, soldiers, even children. It promised calm, purity, and a painless world. But inside every drop was a quieter deception, faster and sweeter than anything before. Within a decade, the hero of medicine became the villain of humanity. Hospitals turned into havens, and patients into prisoners. The world didn't invent heroin to get high, it invented heroin to feel safe, and never woke up again. If history's sweetest lies keep you awake, hit like, subscribe, and tell me, what do you think we fear more, pain or peace? Close your eyes now, and let's drift back, not to the sterile gleam of a laboratory, but to a time when the very first whispers of forgetting stirred from the earth. Imagine the Fertile Crescent, bathed in the warmth of an ancient sun, thousands upon thousands of years ago. You are there, perhaps an early Sumerian, walking through fields where a certain flower unfurls its delicate, vibrant petals against the dust. It is the opium poppy, a plant whose beauty belies the profound secret held within its simple pod. You watch as a careful hand, perhaps an early healer or a priestess, makes a shallow incision into the pod's green skin. From that wound, slowly, pearly drops begin to well, weeping like tears of the earth. This is the milk of dreams, a sticky, ethereal sap. The Sumerians, in their reverence and wonder, called this plant Hul Gil, the joy plant. You can almost hear the soft hum of their voices, feel the gentle breeze stirring the fields of these ancient flowers. This milky essence was not merely a plant. It entwined itself with the very fabric of early human existence. It was medicine, gently soothing the aches of tired bodies and the unseen pangs of the soul. It became a sacred offering, a bridge to the divine in elaborate rituals, allowing the mind to wander beyond the mundane, into visions or profound tranquility. And for some, it offered escape, a quiet retreat from the harsh realities of daily struggles, a temporary forgetting that felt like solace. Imagine a mother gently administering a tiny drop to a fretful child, or a warrior seeking peace after the brutal clamor of battle. It was a comfort, a whisper of calm in a world that offered so little. As time unfurled its scroll, this powerful plant journeyed across lands and cultures. You find yourself now in ancient Egypt, where the poppy's gift was deemed worthy of accompanying pharaohs into the afterlife. They believed it would grant them the long sleep, a peaceful slumber carrying their spirits safely into eternity. Picture the hushed chambers, the elaborate tombs, dried poppy pods nestled carefully among treasures, silent guardians of a journey beyond life. The air is thick with the scent of spices and mystery, the poppy's power held with sacred reverence. Then, drift further west, to the sun-drenched lands of ancient Greece, where the gods themselves were touched by its influence. Morpheus, the weaver of dreams, was said to draw his power from its slumberous embrace. Hypnos, the personification of sleep, held a branch of poppies, a symbol of the peace he offered. Even Thanatos, the quiet angel of death, was linked to its profound finality. You can almost hear the soft murmur of their myths, poets weaving tales of oblivion and serenity, all emanating from this humble plant. You walk through their temples, seeing its depiction in art, a subtle acknowledgement of its sway over the human spirit. Later, you stand with Galen, the renowned Roman physician, as he recognizes and codifies its medicinal properties. He elevates opium to a staple, a cornerstone of his pharmacopoeia, declaring it the mother of all medicines. Watch as he meticulously grinds the dried sap, preparing tinctures and salves, confident in its ability to quell suffering. In the bustling markets of Rome, its presence is felt a silent promise of relief. It was a panacea, a universal remedy for myriad afflictions, from coughs to chronic pain, easing the burdens of a vast empire. Through these myriad experiences, humanity, you realize, began to learn a profound and dangerous lesson: the pleasure of forgetting, the subtle art of stepping away from discomfort, from grief, from the relentless march of time, into a realm of gentle detachment. This ancient, serene journey into the poppy's embrace was, in a way, the very first step onto a path from which retreat would prove almost impossible. You understand, perhaps, that the first addiction didn't begin with a conscious craving for vice, but with a natural, understandable human desire for comfort, a quiet seeking of peace. It began in the innocent pursuit of relief, a path that twisted and turned across millennia. You can almost hear the soft whisper echoing through the ages. The first addiction began in the first civilization, a stark truth, a testament to our enduring search for solace, even at the highest cost. There's a quiet irony in this ancient remedy, a product of peace that would eventually bring such profound disquiet. Pain relief. You might muse, the oldest product with no refunds. A gentle, yet sobering thought, as the ancient light of the poppy fields fades into the dawning of a new era. The ancient world's gentle understanding of the poppy, a reverence mingled with pragmatism, began to shift as centuries turned. You feel the slow, methodical march of progress. From an age of alchemical mysticism to the sharp, clear light of scientific inquiry. It's the cusp of the 19th century, a time of burgeoning reason and insatiable curiosity, when the veil between natural wonder and analytical dissection began to thin. You stand at the threshold of this transformation, witnessing a new kind of mind seeking to unlock nature's secrets. Our journey now takes you to a quiet apothecary in Germany in the early 1800s. The air is redolent with dried herbs, dust, and the metallic tang of nascent chemistry. You observe a young apprentice, Friedrich Serturner, his brow furrowed with relentless determination. He isn't merely observing, he is meticulously dissecting the very joy plant that so captivated the ancients. See the glint of the lamp on his spectacles, the careful movements of his hands as he works late into the night. He is driven by a profound need to understand, to isolate the true power, the very essence of the poppy's magic, to extract it from its messy, inconsistent, natural form. With patience bordering on obsession, Serturner painstakingly isolates a hidden power, a concentrated strength he names Principium Somniferum, the somniferous principle, the very heart of the poppy's ability to induce sleep and ease pain. You watch him purify this extract, transforming the raw, dark opium into something crystalline, something pure and white. Imagine the quiet triumph, the profound sense of discovery as he gazes upon these gleaming crystals. each facet holding the concentrated promise of oblivion. He names this powerful substance morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, a fitting tribute to its profound effect on the human mind. This moment marks a monumental shift. Morphine becomes the world's first truly pure painkiller, no longer a variable concoction. Its effects were now predictable, measurable, and, in its lethal potential, deadly consistent. You realize that medicine, once an art of intuition and herbal wisdom, was now beginning its transformation into arithmetic, a science of precise dosage and quantifiable outcomes. Pain, once an existential burden, was being reduced to an equation, a chemical reaction that could, theoretically, be solved. You feel the quiet excitement of this new era, the promise of control over the unpredictable forces of the body. But with this power came the first, chilling echoes of its danger. You witnessed Sir Turner's early, audacious trials, driven by an unyielding desire to fully comprehend his discovery. He tested it on himself, and then, in a shocking display of scientific fervor, on his own friends, almost claiming their lives in his pursuit of knowledge. You can almost hear the frantic whispers, the desperate fear in the air as his colleagues teetered on the brink of death, only narrowly saved. This harrowing experience serves as a stark, early lesson that curiosity, in its purest, most relentless form, might just be mankind's most addictive trait. The yearning to know, to control, to master the forces of nature, can be as compelling and as perilous as any substance. Reflect on the beauty and terror of this scientific leap. The poppy, once a symbol of gentle sleep and spiritual journey, was now rendered into a precise chemical compound, stripped of its ancient mystique, imbued instead with a formidable, quantifiable potency. The quiet, inconsistent comfort of opium was replaced by the sharp, undeniable power of morphine. You understand that this wasn't just about pain relief. It was about human ambition, the relentless drive to push boundaries, to find answers, even if those answers came with unforeseen consequences. The journey from the fields of Sumer to Sir Turner's laboratory was a journey from raw nature to refined science, a path that would irrevocably alter the landscape of human suffering and human vulnerability. The quiet hum of the laboratory now feels heavier, laden with both hope and a nascent, unsettling dread. Sir Turner's isolation of morphine opened a door, but it was the next technological leap that would fling it wide, forever changing the relationship between pain, medicine, and the human body. You sense a quickening in the pace of innovation, a tangible shift in how substances would interact with our very being. We move forward to the 1850s, a time when a simple, yet utterly revolutionary instrument makes its debut, the hypodermic syringe. Imagine the wonder, the slight apprehension as this slender tool with its sharp needle and precise plunger is introduced. It feels like a delicate, almost surgical invasion, bypassing the slow, digestive path to deliver its potent cargo directly, swiftly, into the bloodstream, into the very core of one's consciousness. Suddenly, morphine was no longer a substance to be swallowed or held under the tongue, slowly seeping into the system. With the syringe, it could bypass the stomach's gentle filtering, traveling immediately, intensely, into the soul itself. You can almost feel the rush, the profound instantaneousness of its effect, a sensation far more potent and immediate than anything experienced before. This was not just a delivery mechanism, it was a revolution in relief, a direct line to oblivion. The true, brutal test of this new technology arrived with the American Civil War. You are transported to the grim, makeshift hospitals, the blood-soaked fields where suffering was boundless and relentless. Doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of agony, discovered morphine's godlike control over pain. You see surgeons, their faces etched with exhaustion, working tirelessly, amputating limbs, binding wounds, while soldiers, in a haze of morphine, survived these horrific procedures. They were awake, yet aware of nothing but a blissful, narcotic-induced peace. The scream was silenced, the agony averted. It was a miracle of sorts, a profound mercy in an otherwise merciless conflict. You hear the hushed praise for the drug, the desperate gratitude from those whose lives it touched. But peace, when it finally arrived, did not end the war within these men. The soldiers, having found solace in the needle, carried morphine home in their veins, an invisible, insidious wound that no armistice could heal. You picture them, returning to quiet farms and bustling cities, their bodies bearing the scars of battle, their minds bearing the unseen marks of a different kind of captivity. This became known as the soldier's disease, America's first widespread prescription plague. The syringe, once a symbol of compassionate healing, now represented a silent, ongoing struggle. Morphine, once a beacon of hope on the battlefield, became medicine, salvation, and a lifelong sentence. You hear the quiet desperation in their voices, the persistent ache that only a familiar dose could quell. The irony is stark. Almost chilling, the war had ended. But the pain, you realize, had merely changed uniforms. It had shed its military guise and crept silently into homes, families, and the very heart of a nation trying to heal. You might hear the doctors, burdened by the sheer scale of this new affliction, whispering promises to themselves and to their patients. A safer morphine must exist, they would murmur, their voices filled with a yearning for a cleaner, less treacherous path to pain relief. They were searching for a way to deliver comfort without the cruel cost of dependence, an elusive ideal that would drive the next chapter of this unfolding story. You feel the weight of this collective longing, this quiet yearning for a miracle that would banish suffering without inviting a new kind of chain. The promise of relief, now delivered with such surgical precision, had revealed a new, deeper vulnerability in the human spirit, a testament to the complex dance between healing and harm. The age of the needle had arrived, and with it, a new understanding of how deeply chemical solace could penetrate and reshape the human experience. The widespread suffering and dependence caused by morphine, a testament to humanity's tireless quest for an end to pain, cast a long shadow over the late 19th century. Yet, this very shadow fueled a relentless ambition, particularly within Europe's burgeoning chemical industries. You sense the vibrant, almost feverish atmosphere of innovation, a time when science promised to unlock every secret, to solve every human ill. Our journey now takes us to Germany again, to the formidable doors of Bayer, a company that had risen from the vibrant hues of dye manufacturing to become a powerful chemical empire, driven by ambition and an almost evangelical belief in progress. Bayer had just achieved remarkable success with aspirin, a gentle marvel that soothed everyday aches without the heavy hand of morphine. This triumph, however, only whetted their appetite for another miracle, a pharmaceutical breakthrough that would cement their legacy and perhaps truly conquer pain itself. You can almost hear the hum of their massive laboratories, the quiet clicking of glass, the determined murmur of scientists and chemists, all striving for the next grand discovery. It is in this environment of intense scientific pursuit that we return to Felix Hoffmann. You observe him in his pristine laboratory, a young chemist of brilliant focus, tasked with the noble goal of finding a less addictive alternative to morphine. With meticulous precision, he began to tweak the morphine molecule, working with acetic anhydride. His hands are steady, his mind alight with the potential of altering nature's design to create something purer, something better. Imagine the quiet hours, the countless trials, the meticulous notes taken as he sought to refine, to improve upon what was already considered a potent remedy. His efforts bore fruit, a new compound, a modification of morphine, which he presented to his superior, Professor Heinrich Dresser. You watch as Dresser, a figure of authority and deep scientific curiosity, begins to test this new creation. He observes its effects, a profound sense of calm, an unexpected surge of energy, and an almost euphoric feeling, an uplifting sensation that made subjects feel, in his own words, heroic. This new substance seemed to elevate the spirit, to imbue one with immense capability and well-being. And so, they named it Heroin, a direct homage to the German word heroisch, meaning heroic. You feel the pride in their discovery, the genuine belief that they had found a truly superior substance, a champion in the fight against human suffering. They envisioned it as non-addictive, safer than morphine, a universal curative for an array of ailments. You see elegant glass bottles being prepared, their labels proclaiming this new wonder drug, intended for everything from persistent coughs to debilitating pain. Even children, suffering from whooping cough or other childhood miseries, were deemed suitable recipients for its gentle, heroic embrace. Bayer, with its immense marketing machine, unleashed this new hero upon the world. Free samples flooded the globe, sent to doctors, pharmacists, and medical institutions. It was a pharmaceutical Trojan horse, presented as a gift, promising solace and safety, carrying within its clear, golden liquid a secret, potent power. You imagine the enthusiastic endorsements, the widespread acceptance, the hopeful relief of countless individuals receiving this seemingly benign remedy. The tagline, echoing with a chilling, unintended irony, spread like wildfire. The hero has arrived. Little did anyone realize, in that moment of fervent hope and scientific pride, that this new hero would soon reveal itself as one of humanity's most cunning and devastating adversaries. The quiet hum of the Bayer laboratory, once filled with the promise of relief, now resonates with the unspoken tremors of a world teetering on the edge of a new, profound deception. With the hero unleashed, a new era of seemingly boundless relief dawned, its light shining blindingly, masking the shadows that gathered just beyond its glow. You witness the innocent, almost joyful embrace of heroin by a world eager for solace. Doctors, impressed by Bayer's scientific reputation and the drug's apparent efficacy, prescribed heroin as readily as they would aspirin. Imagine the trusting conversations in examination rooms, the quiet reassurance given to patients, the belief in progress and the wisdom of science. It seemed to offer everything morphine lacked: purity, potency, and, crucially, a promise of non-addictive calm. Mothers, seeking respite for their suffering little ones, gently administered heroin to their coughing children, believing they were offering a profound act of comfort and healing. Picture worried brows smoothing as a child's cough subsided, replaced by peaceful slumber. The air in these homes was filled with the scent of hope, the quiet relief of parents believing they had found a safe haven from childhood ailments. It was presented as a gentle blessing, a benevolent white powder that brought quiet to troubled nights. For those already entangled in the grip of morphine addiction, heroin was hailed as a miraculous escape, a pathway to recovery. You observe individuals, once trembling and desperate, now offered a cleaner, smoother alternative. They weren't truly recovering. They were simply switching their chains, exchanging one form of captivity for another, often a more potent one. The illusion of improvement was powerful, a testament to the drug's immediate effects and the world's fervent desire to believe in its benevolent nature. Yet, amidst this wave of widespread adoption, subtle, unsettling warnings began to surface. Whispers of increasing dependence, of escalating doses, of a quiet, relentless craving that surpassed even that of morphine. But these early warnings were largely dismissed, often labeled as hysteria, the anxious overreactions of a few in the face of a scientific marvel. You feel the resistance to doubt, the human tendency to cling to a comforting narrative, especially when backed by the formidable authority of science and commerce. Science itself, in its methodical, often slow progression, was reluctant to admit guilt or even to acknowledge the developing crisis. The commercial interests of Bayer, having invested so much in its miracle drug, were even slower, actively downplaying any adverse reports. You perceive the quiet tension between emerging empirical evidence and the powerful inertia of economic incentive, a tension that would continue to define the drug's tragic narrative. The insidious truth lay in the drug's very chemistry. Heroin, it was discovered, crossed the blood-brain barrier far faster than morphine. This chemical precision meant that every dose delivered a super morphine rush, a quicker, more intense wave of euphoria and pain relief. You might visualize it as a swift, invisible current, sweeping through the brain with unparalleled speed, recalibrating the very centers of pleasure and reward with each potent surge. By 1905, the whispers of concern began to amplify. No longer easily dismissed, they transformed into headlines, into public anxieties, into a growing realization that something profoundly wrong was unfolding. The initial promise of the hero was dissolving, revealing the deeper, darker reality beneath. Humanity, you realize, was learning a harsh yet enduring lesson that miracles, particularly those of the chemical kind, often sell far better than mathematical precision or slow, difficult truths. The allure of instantaneous relief, of a swift escape from suffering, had proven irresistible. The world had bought into the sweetest lie, and the cost, you sense, was only just beginning to be tallied. The gentle light of the laboratory, once so promising, now casts long, uncertain shadows. The sweet lie of heroin, once embraced as a benevolent miracle, could not sustain itself indefinitely against the mounting weight of human suffering it was inadvertently creating. You feel the turning of the tide, the slow, agonizing realization that what was hailed as a cure had become a deeper affliction. Doctors, who had so eagerly prescribed the drug, finally began to see an undeniable, chilling pattern. It manifested not as the promised calm, but as a relentless cycle of withdrawal, an obsessive craving that consumed patients, leading to physical and mental collapse. You hear the growing alarm in their voices, the dawning horror in their eyes as they connected the dots between the pristine white powder and the deteriorating lives before them. The very first heroinism clinics began to appear, somber institutions dedicated to treating this new, devastating addiction. Imagine the hushed corridors, the bewildered faces of patients. Drawn from every walk of life, women who had sought relief from chronic pain. Teachers prescribed it for persistent coughs, even priests, searching for solace from an unseen spiritual burden. All found themselves bound by the same invisible chains, forged by a drug they had been assured was safe, even heroic. It was a poignant display of how medicine, in its earnest quest for healing, could inadvertently become the architect of widespread dependency. As the truth became impossible to ignore, Bayer, the proud parent of the hero, began a quiet, almost imperceptible retreat. Their formidable reputation, once gleaming with the success of aspirin, now bled silently, stained by the undeniable consequences of their earlier ambition. You sense the corporate tension, the hushed meetings, the desperate attempts to manage a public relations disaster, all while the drug they created continued its destructive path. Heroin, once found in elegant pharmacies, carefully dispensed by pharmacists, now began its descent into the shadows, exiting the respectable light of medicine and entering the furtive, darker world of alleys and back streets. The transformation of the patient into the fiend became a tragic, unavoidable narrative. You hear the harsh, judgmental language emerging in society, casting blame rather than offering understanding. The quiet suffering of addiction was increasingly met with stigma and condemnation, fueling a cycle of shame and isolation. Medical journals, once extolling heroin's virtues, now published stark warnings, describing it not just as an addiction, but as a contagion, a creeping disease that threatened the moral fabric of society. There is a dark irony that settles heavily upon this chapter. The drug that was introduced as a cure for addiction, as a safer alternative to morphine, had, in a cruel twist of fate, become its sequel. You witness the painful, circular nature of human ambition and vulnerability, a pattern that would repeat itself time and again through history. Knowledge of its dangers grew, certainly, but empathy, you observe, began to fade. The understanding of the addict as a patient gave way to the perception of the addict as a criminal, a moral failure. This shift in perspective would have profound and lasting consequences, shaping the future of drug policy and society's response to addiction for decades to come. The promise of pure, non-addictive relief had shattered, leaving in its wake a bitter legacy of dependence and disillusionment. The serene lab, the hopeful patient, the grand enterprise, all now dissolving into a landscape of regret and quiet despair. The quiet despair of patients and the retreating shadow of corporate responsibility paved the way for a new, forceful response, a legal declaration that would redefine the landscape of addiction and usher in an era of unprecedented control. You feel the shifting winds of public opinion and political will, moving from hesitant concern to decisive, albeit flawed, action. It is 1914 in America. Grappling with the escalating crisis of drug dependence, enacts the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, the nation's first true federal drug law. You witness its genesis, framed ostensibly as a taxation measure, a simple means of regulating the distribution of narcotics. Yet, beneath this administrative veneer, it was enforced as outright prohibition, a dramatic declaration of war against certain substances. Suddenly, physicians, who had once been hailed as healers, found themselves caught in a perilous legal net. You perceive their confusion, their fear, as treating addicts, once a humanitarian duty, was now increasingly criminalized. The act, intended to curb drug use, instead turned doctors into reluctant gatekeepers, afraid to provide essential care for fear of legal repercussions. This created a profound dilemma. How could one treat an illness when the very act of treatment could lead to imprisonment? The sacred bond between doctor and patient was fractured, imbued with suspicion and legal threat. Concurrently, those suffering from addiction, once viewed as patients deserving of medical attention, were now redefined. You watch as they are criminalized for their condition, branded as lawbreakers rather than individuals grappling with a disease. This profound shift in language and legal status stripped them of their dignity, pushing them further into the margins of society. The Heroin Act, in its attempt to control, effectively transformed public health issues into matters of criminal justice. The immediate consequence was a dramatic collapse of the legitimate supply of heroin and other narcotics. Pharmacies, once open sources of relief, now shut their doors to those who depended on these substances. Yet, the immutable law of demand remained. Addiction, a deeply entrenched physiological and psychological reality, did not simply vanish because a law was passed. You observe the quiet desperation, the urgent need, that persisted even as legal channels dried up. This vacuum, created by well-intentioned but ill-conceived legislation, proved fertile ground for something new and dangerous, the birth of the black market. You see shadowy figures emerging, illicit networks forming, ready to capitalize on the unmet demand. The syringe, once a symbol of sterile medical intervention, became a tool of desperation, replacing the prescription pad as the means of acquiring the drug. The quiet hum of legal commerce was replaced by the furtive whispers of illegal trade. You might hear a cynical, almost humorous observation emerge from the era. Congress cured addiction by banning doctors. A dark jest, perhaps, but one that captures the profound irony of the situation. Instead of solving the problem, the Heroin Act inadvertently laid the foundation for the complex, enduring struggle that would become known, eventually, as the drug war. America, you realize, had invented this war long before it gave it a proper name, setting a precedent that would shape its approach to drug policy for the entire century and beyond. The battle lines were drawn, not on a foreign field, but within its own borders, turning its citizens into adversaries in a conflict that would prove far more intricate and devastating than anyone could have foreseen. The gentle hope of medicine had given way to the stark, unforgiving landscape of legal enforcement. The legislative hammer of the Heroin Act, rather than eradicating the desire for heroin, merely hammered it deeper underground, forging a new, clandestine economy where the drug transformed into a commodity more precious and dangerous than gold. You sense the shifting dynamics, the quiet hum of an emergent underworld. Thriving in the shadows cast by prohibition, heroin, once a pharmaceutical product, was now traded like a rare treasure, smaller, lighter, and deadlier in its illicit form. Our journey now takes you across continents, tracing the invisible threads of this nascent global trade. You envision the sun-drenched poppy fields of Turkey, where raw opium was still cultivated, harvested by hands perhaps unaware of its ultimate destination. From these ancient lands, the raw material began its journey, smuggled across borders, making its way to secret laboratories nestled within the bustling port city of Marseille, France. You picture the clandestine operations, the hushed conversations, the discreet exchanges under the cover of night. Here, in these hidden labs, a new breed of chemist emerged, precision criminals, often with ties to the Corsican mafia. Imagine their faces, their focused intensity, as they meticulously refined the raw opium into its potent, white powdered form. They weren't guided by scientific curiosity or the pursuit of health, but by the relentless logic of profit. Their product was Heroin number 4, a purer, more refined substance, gleaming white and worth an absolute fortune on the burgeoning black market. You almost feel the fine, powdery texture, the cold, stark beauty of its illicit perfection. Once processed, this deadly commodity began its final, crucial leg of the journey across the Atlantic. The mafia, with its iron grip on the New York docks, became the undisputed masters of distribution within the United States. You envision large cargo ships quietly unloading their legitimate goods, while beneath the bustle, hidden packages of the precious white powder were discreetly transferred, slipping through the customs net. This intricate network, a masterpiece of logistical criminal enterprise, became known as the French Connection, a phrase that conjuring images of shadowy figures, high-stakes deals, and a flow of narcotics as smooth as silk, yet colder than death in its ultimate impact. This wasn't just fragmented crime. This was the birth of the first true global drug corporation. You understand that this complex web, spanning continents and involving multiple criminal organizations, operated with a chilling efficiency that rivaled legitimate businesses. Bayer's ghost. The spirit of scientific ambition twisted into illicit enterprise, lived on. But now, it wore a fedora. Its ledger books filled with blood money rather than pharmaceutical profits. You might find a dark, knowing humor in the thought. Same business model, different accountants. The core principle of meeting demand with supply, of creating and distributing a product, remained unchanged. Only the legality, the ethics, and the human cost had been drastically altered. This era marked a profound transformation, not just in how drugs were distributed, but in the very nature of organized crime itself. It became a sophisticated, international enterprise, fueled by a single, potent product. The quiet desperation of addicts, once a medical concern, was now a powerful economic engine, driving a vast, shadowy empire that would continue to grow and adapt, seemingly impervious to every attempt at suppression. The quiet hum of the underworld had begun, a persistent, unsettling thrum beneath the veneer of legitimate society. The sprawling, global web of heroin distribution, meticulously spun by the underworld, continued to expand and adapt, weaving itself into the very fabric of geopolitical conflict. You sense the profound irony of war, a crucible of suffering, also becoming a fertile ground for addiction's growth. Our journey now takes us to Vietnam, a land of lush, unforgiving jungle, where war met paradise, and where the agony of conflict birthed a new wave of withdrawal. You are transported to the humid, suffocating landscape of the Vietnam War in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Amidst the relentless tension, the fear, and the profound dehumanization of combat, a new commodity emerged: pure heroin, often called China White. It was astonishingly cheap, available for as little as $2 per vial in the bustling, chaotic streets of Saigon. Picture desperate young soldiers, far from home, facing unimaginable horrors, finding a fleeting, powerful escape in this readily available solace. In the quiet lulls between patrols, in the makeshift barracks, soldiers found themselves smoking the drug instead of shooting their rifles. The ritual, known as chasing the dragon, involved heating the heroin on foil and inhaling the rising plumes of white smoke. You can almost smell the acrid sweetness in the air, a silent testament to the number of young men seeking oblivion. Addiction, you observe with a heavy heart, spread faster than bullets through the ranks, an invisible epidemic sweeping through the American forces. It was a quieter, more insidious enemy than the Viet Cong, striking at the spirit rather than the body. Commanders, grappling with the immense challenges of warfare, often denied the scale of the problem, fearing the impact on morale and readiness. Meanwhile, medics, witnessing the quiet desperation firsthand, despaired at their inability to stem the tide. You hear the hushed conversations, the desperate attempts to conceal widespread use, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Estimates suggest that as many as 40,000 U.S. soldiers became addicted, a quiet army, fighting an internal war, their bodies and minds under siege by the very substance meant to provide escape. The gravity of the situation eventually reached the highest echelons of power. You witness President Nixon confronted with the staggering reality of addiction within the military, declaring it public enemy number one. The urgency was palpable, the threat to national security and public morale undeniable. His administration launched Operation Golden Flow, a drastic, unprecedented measure requiring all returning soldiers to urinate clean before they could go home. Imagine the long lines, the anxiety, the profound sense of betrayal felt by those forced to undergo these tests, their humanity reduced to a specimen in a cup. This moment, you realize, marks a pivotal turning point. The war on drugs, an abstract concept barely articulated before, officially began with a simple test cup. It was a declaration of war not just on a substance, but on the individuals who consumed it, on the very condition of addiction itself. The jungle of white smoke, once a private hell for soldiers, now became a public crisis, forever altering America's perception of drug use and solidifying the punitive approach that would dominate drug policy for decades to come. The quiet desperation of a generation, seeking respite from the brutality of war, had merely exchanged one battlefield for another. The battlefield of Vietnam, with its pervasive white smoke, gradually receded for the returning soldiers. But the war for many was far from over. You feel the profound shift from the chaos of combat to the bewildering stillness of home, a transition fraught with unseen dangers. Veterans, bearing the invisible wounds of addiction, returned to an America ill-equipped and often unwilling to understand their plight. They were addicted, often broke, and in many heartbreaking cases, forgotten by the very society they had served. The heroin they found back home was a cruel parody of what they had known overseas. It was weak, diluted, and frequently contaminated with dangerous impurities, a stark contrast to the pure Rasa China white of Saigon. Imagine the desperate search, the profound disappointment, the increased risks as they injected unknown substances into their veins. Needles, once a means of temporary solace in a foreign land, became their only bridge back to the past, a desperate attempt to rekindle the fleeting oblivion that had offered respite from the horrors of war. Society, grappling with its own internal divisions and the trauma of Vietnam, often labeled these returning soldiers as failures rather than casualties. You hear the harsh judgments, the lack of empathy, the profound misunderstanding that met their struggles. They had fought the Viet Cong, endured unimaginable hardship, and yet, in the eyes of many, they had lost to chemistry a personal failing rather than a consequence of their service. The quiet suffering of these men and women was met with condemnation, pushing them further into isolation. The Veterans Affairs hospitals, already strained and underfunded, were largely unprepared and often uncaring in the face of this unprecedented wave of addiction. You picture the bureaucratic indifference, the overwhelmed staff, the inadequate resources. These institutions, meant to heal, often became places of further despair, unable to provide the comprehensive treatment and compassion so desperately needed. The quiet heroism of their service was often eclipsed by the stigma of their addiction. As the addiction crisis deepened, crime began to rise, driven by the desperate need to sustain habits in a world that offered little support. Empathy, you observe with a somber heart, fell victim to fear and judgment. A new America was born, one that was skeptical of its government, scared of its internal threats, and increasingly sedated by its own anxieties. The echoes of Vietnam reverberated not just in foreign policy, but in the very soul of the nation, fostering a climate of distrust and disillusionment. Another war, you realize, had begun internal and invisible, fought within the homes and minds of countless individuals. It was a war against craving, against stigma, against a society that struggled to reconcile the hero with the addict. The homecoming, once a dream, had transformed into a profound and personal hell for a generation. The quiet despair of individual lives, once sacrificed for a nation, now faded into the background, a somber footnote in a long and arduous conflict. As the 1970s dawned, the internal war waged by returning veterans found its echo in the heart of America's urban centers, particularly the Bronx. You feel the palpable sense of decay, the slow erosion of hope that settled over these once vibrant communities. Cities began to rot from within, jobs vanished, taking with them the dreams and aspirations of entire neighborhoods. And in that void, hope, you realize, quietly followed suit, leaving behind a landscape ripe for exploitation and despair. Empty buildings, once symbols of aspiration, now stood as hollowed-out monuments to urban decline. They transformed into shooting galleries, silent witnesses to the desperate rituals of addiction. Imagine the dim light filtering through broken windows, the hushed murmurs, the discarded syringes littering the floors. The air in these forgotten spaces was thick with the scent of decay and the bitter tang of burned foil, a silent testament to lives lived on the fringes. Dealers, recognizing the profound desperation of these communities, began to brand their bags of heroin, giving them names that were both alluring and chillingly prophetic. Red Dragon, Last Ride. Picture the tiny, meticulously stamped bags, each one a promise of temporary escape, a fleeting journey away from the harsh realities of life. These brand names were whispered on street corners, traded in hushed tones, becoming a morbid form of folk art in the urban decay. In this environment of desolation, figures like Nicky Barnes emerged in Harlem, building vast heroin corporations from the rubble of forgotten lives. You observe the chilling efficiency of his operation, a criminal empire that mirrored the very corporations that once thrived in more legitimate sectors. Poverty, you realize, was being expertly converted into profit. the relentless cycle of addiction fueling fortunes for those at its helm. Addiction, in a grotesque twist, became the very architecture of these neighborhoods. The desperate demand for heroin dictated the flow of money, the networks of people, and the very rhythm of life in places like the Bronx. You see the silent transactions, the hurried exchanges, the subtle codes, all orchestrated by the invisible hand of the drug trade. The state, in its attempts to intervene, largely fought symptoms with batons and arrests, rather than addressing the deeper wounds with therapy, rehabilitation, or economic opportunity. You feel the futility of this approach, the endless cycle of enforcement without true healing. The American dream, once a beacon of possibility, felt incredibly distant in these streets. For many, it had shrunk to the size of a $10 bag, a transient chemical promise of peace in a world that offered so little of it. You might hear a dark, knowing humor, a bitter observation from those who lived through it. Wall Street had bulls, the Bronx had needles. A stark comparison, highlighting the divergent realities of a nation. The quiet hum of urban decay now felt amplified, a cacophony of sirens, desperation, and the ever-present whispers of the drug that held so many captive. The hope for urban renewal seemed to dissolve into the white smoke of desperate pursuits. The intricate, sophisticated web of the global heroin trade, anchored by the legendary French Connection, seemed impenetrable, a testament to its seamless criminal efficiency. Yet, even the most robust empires eventually face their challenges. You sense a shift in the balance of power, a concerted effort from law enforcement to unravel the threads of this vast enterprise. Our journey now focuses on the determined, methodical efforts to dismantle the pipeline that had funneled pure heroin from the laboratories of Marseille into the streets of New York. You witness the painstaking investigative work, the patient surveillance, the coordination between international agencies. Slowly, meticulously, law enforcement began to crack the Marseille pipeline, tracing the routes, identifying the key players, and intercepting the illicit cargo. The quiet operations, once so secure, were now exposed, one by one. The Corsican chemists, the architects of heroin number 4, began to fall, their carefully constructed operations collapsing under the relentless pressure of justice. Imagine the raids, the arrests, the tangible sense of disruption as this vital artery of the global drug trade was severed. The fall of the French Connection, while a significant victory for law enforcement, did not, however, extinguish the insatiable demand for heroin. It merely forced a profound and far-reaching redirection of the trade. You observe the global network, resilient and adaptive, shifting its focus. The primary sources of heroin now moved away from the Mediterranean and towards new, burgeoning centers in Mexico and the vast poppy fields of Asia. The geographic landscape of the drug trade was being reshaped, a testament to the persistent human desire for the drug and the boundless ingenuity of those who supplied it. Even with the arrest of figures like Nicky Barnes, whose empire had once dominated Harlem and the Bronx, the broader demand for heroin remained robust. His formidable organization fractured, certainly, but the void was quickly filled. New cartels emerged, smaller, hungrier, and often more ruthless, vying for control of the lucrative market. You see the fragmentation, the proliferation of smaller, more aggressive players, each seeking to carve out their own piece of the pie. As the sources diversified and the supply chains became more complex, the purity of the product began to decline. Heroin, once a relatively consistent substance, now varied wildly in strength and composition, often cut with dangerous adulterants. This decline in purity, coupled with the instability of the market, led to a tragic consequence: overdose deaths began to spike. Heroin, you realize, had become the currency of chaos, its unpredictable nature a direct threat to the lives of those who sought its fleeting comfort. Governments, in their public pronouncements, often claimed victory with each major bust, each dismantled pipeline. Yet, you observe a quiet, knowing cynicism from the users, who understood that as long as the demand persisted, new suppliers would always emerge. The system, in its relentless pursuit of eradication, learned a painful lesson: crime adapts faster than policy. No matter how many connections were severed, how many leaders were jailed, the underlying yearning for escape remained. You ponder the profound truth that no war, not even a war on drugs, is shorter than the war on pain, a struggle as old as humanity itself. The quiet hum of the legal system, in its moment of triumph, was already being overshadowed by the adaptability of the underworld. As the French Connection fragmented and the heroin trade diversified, a new, formidable empire began to consolidate its power in a region both breathtakingly beautiful and tragically cursed: the Golden Triangle. You feel the humid air of Southeast Asia, hear the rustle of dense jungle, and sense the profound political complexities that allowed this new drug kingdom to flourish. This was not merely a criminal enterprise, it was a geopolitical phenomenon, intertwined with Cold War strategy and local power struggles. Our journey takes you to the rugged, often inaccessible borderlands, where Burma, Laos, and Thailand converge the very geography of narcotics. You learn that this region became a crucible for opium production, fueled by a unique confluence of circumstances. After their defeat in the Chinese Civil War, remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist armies retreated into these remote hills. Cut off from external support, these defeated soldiers found a ready source of funding for their rebellion against the newly established communist regimes: the cultivation and trade of opium. You picture the clandestine operations, the disciplined soldiers now turned warlords supervising vast poppy fields, their uniforms faded, their ideologies clinging to a desperate, illicit lifeline. In a profound and unsettling twist of Cold War politics, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, driven by the imperative to counter communism, formed unlikely alliances. You observe the quiet, often morally ambiguous decisions made in distant offices. As the CIA allied with these same anti-communist proxies, the logic was clear. If ethically fraught, these armies, funded by opium, were a convenient bulwark against the spread of communism. And so, a tacit, unholy alliance was formed. Air America, a civilian airline covertly operated by the CIA, flew guns and supplies into these remote areas, bolstering the anti-communist forces. And, in return, you understand, they often flew heroin out, completing a devastating circle of covert aid and illicit trade. Local warlords, figures like the notorious Kun Sa, seized upon this geopolitical vacuum. You picture them, charismatic and ruthless, building vast jungle kingdoms, their power resting entirely on the control of opium fields and heroin production. Their brand, Double Globe, became a symbol of luxury heroin, destined for markets around the world. signaling a certain purity and potency. Entire economies in these remote regions, you realize, became dependent on the cultivation, processing, and distribution of narcotics. Villages thrived or withered based on the poppy harvest, their fate inextricably linked to the addiction of strangers across the globe. The moral contradictions of this era piled higher than the mountains themselves. Nations preached freedom and democracy, while covertly facilitating a trade that enslaved millions. You might feel the weight of this irony, the profound disconnect between stated ideals and covert actions. Freedom, financed by poppies. You muse a quiet, chilling summary of a complex and tragic chapter in the history of heroin. The quiet rustle of the jungle leaves now seems to carry the whispers of covert deals and moral compromises, forever etched into the landscape of the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle's rise to prominence further solidified heroin's position as an undeniable force on the global stage. You feel the intricate connections, the subtle tightening of a web that now spanned every continent, binding diverse cultures and economies through the silent language of addiction. By the 1980s, heroin was no longer merely a local problem or a regional conflict. It had become an international language, understood and spoken by cartels, syndicates, and desperate individuals across the planet. You observe the convergence of criminal organizations, each powerful in their own right, now sharing a single, lucrative product. The established mafia families, the enigmatic triads of Asia, the formidable yakuza of Japan, and the emerging, ruthless cartels of Latin America all found common ground in the trafficking of heroin. You envision the clandestine meetings, the sophisticated logistics, the shared ambition that transcended cultural differences, all focused on feeding the insatiable global demand. Even more unsettling, intelligence agencies, locked in the geopolitical chess games of the Cold War and its aftermath, often turned a blind eye to these illicit activities. You sense the complex calculations, the moral compromises made in the name of larger strategic objectives. Heroin trafficking was sometimes tolerated, even subtly facilitated, when it offered leverage against a rival nation or funded an anti-communist proxy. The lines between right and wrong blurred, distorted by the demands of international power plays. On the streets, far from the geopolitical machinations, the consequences were devastatingly real. Street purity of heroin fluctuated wildly, creating unpredictable dangers for users. One day, a weak dose might offer little effect. The next, an unexpectedly pure batch could lead to immediate, fatal overdose. You hear the rising statistics of overdose deaths, particularly as they spiked in urban centers, a grim testament to the instability of the illicit market. As these crises unfolded, nations often blamed culture for the problem, pointing fingers at individual moral failings or the perceived degradations of certain communities. Rarely, you note, did they confront the underlying chemistry, the addictive nature of the substance itself, or the systemic failures that allowed it to proliferate. The addict, once viewed with a semblance of medical understanding in the early days, became the enemy again, a societal pariah, a scapegoat for broader anxieties. Governments, in their response, prioritized punishment over healing. You see massive investments poured into prisons and law enforcement, rather than into comprehensive treatment and rehabilitation programs. Addiction, once a medical diagnosis, was systematically rebranded as crime, further entrenching a punitive approach. This shift created an endless feedback loop, where criminalization led to more desperate users. which in turn fueled more punitive measures, without ever addressing the root causes. The world, you realize, had entered a prolonged, self-perpetuating struggle. The tightening of the global web, once seen as a sign of criminal mastery, was now a mirror reflecting humanity's inability to break free from the patterns of denial and punishment. The quiet hum of global commerce, now laced with the dark current of narcotics, continued its relentless, destructive flow. Even as the echoes of heroin chic faded, leaving behind a lingering unease, the fundamental human yearning for pain relief remained a constant, powerful undercurrent. You sense a strange, unsettling paradox emerging in the 1990s, a time when the dark shadow of addiction was paradoxically glorified, transformed into a fashionable statement. This was the era of heroin chic. You witnessed the fashion industry, always a sensitive barometer of societal undercurrents, embracing a new, ethereal ideal of beauty. Models, particularly figures like the iconic Kate Moss, embodied a look characterized by extreme thinness, pale skin, dark circles under the eyes, and a languid, almost wasted demeanor. It was a style that glorified exhaustion, transforming the signs of distress into an edgy, coveted allure. You see the images in magazines, the hollowed-out beauty, the vacant stares, aestheticizing addiction into an art form. Glossy, influential magazines showcase this beautiful decay on their pages, blurring the lines between artifice and reality. The aesthetic of the strung out, the detached, the utterly vulnerable, became a pervasive trend. You hear the music of the era echoing this mood, the melancholic strains of grunge, the trip-hop rhythms of Portishead, the profound nihilism woven into lyrics and melodies. This cultural landscape provided a soundtrack to the visual cues of heroin chic, creating an immersive, almost intoxicating atmosphere of despondency. Photographers, at the forefront of this movement, often lived the very lives they sought to aestheticize. They were not merely observers, they were participants, caught in the undertow of the lifestyle they captured on film. You sensed the blurring of boundaries, the dangerous proximity to the very subject they were portraying, leading some down a perilous path. The tragic death of photographer David Sorrenti at the age of 20, a young talent lost to the very lifestyle he photographed, served as a stark, painful turning point. His passing was a tragedy that turned the mirror back on society, forcing a moment of uncomfortable introspection. The backlash was swift and powerful. You hear President Bill Clinton publicly denounce heroin chic, condemning its insidious glorification of drug use and its harmful influence on young people. His words, ringing with moral urgency, pierced through the fashionable veneer, exposing the destructive reality beneath. The industry, feeling the heat of public outcry and political condemnation, quietly began to retreat. You observe the subtle shift in advertising, the return to brighter lights, healthier aesthetics, as the trend dissipated, deemed no longer acceptable. Society, in its fickle way, moved on to the next trend, the next ideal of beauty. But the drug itself, you realize, never truly left the frame. Its quiet influence, its insidious power, remained a persistent undertow, ready to re-emerge in new forms, under new guises. The fleeting glamour of heroin chic was a stark reminder of humanity's capacity to romanticize even its deepest pains, a dangerous flirtation with darkness that, for some, became a devastating reality. The quiet hum of the fashion world, once so compelling, now felt like a distant, hollow echo. Even as the echoes of heroin chic faded, leaving behind a lingering unease, the fundamental human yearning for pain relief remained a constant, powerful undercurrent. You feel the relentless march of pharmaceutical innovation, ever seeking to fulfill this primal need, even if it meant revisiting familiar pathways. Our journey now takes us to 1996, a year that heralded what many believe to be a new dawn, a pharmaceutical renaissance in pain management. This was the year Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin. You witness its introduction with a sense of déjà vu, a haunting echo of past promises. Here was a drug, the same core molecule as an old, established opioid, but presented with cleaner marketing, a polished exterior designed to inspire trust. It was not heroin, no, but it was another potent opioid, veiled in the legitimacy of a prescription pad. You might discern the subtle brilliance of the marketing, crafting a narrative of safety and efficacy for a drug that would prove to be anything but. Purdue Pharma aggressively promoted OxyContin with a truly astounding claim. It promised less than 1% addiction risk due to its time-release coating. Imagine the persuasive presentations to doctors, the glossy brochures, the confident assertions that this was a breakthrough. Physicians, increasingly educated to treat pain as the fifth vital sign, a metric as important as pulse or temperature, were eager for an effective, seemingly safe solution. Sales representatives, acting as missionaries of relief, fanned out across the country, convincing doctors that chronic pain could and should be managed with this powerful new pill. The impact was swift and profound. OxyContin pills spread like wildfire, moving from the quiet, often ignored pockets of Appalachia to the manicured lawns of suburban America. You see orange prescription bottles piling up in medicine cabinets. The ease with which this potent opioid entered millions of homes. Addicts, you realize, were reborn as patients again. They weren't seeking an illicit high. They were following doctors' orders, trusting in the promise of pain relief, unaware of the insidious journey they were embarking upon. The old poppy, the ancient joy plant, had donned a new disguise. No longer the raw sap of Sumer, nor the crystalline powder of Serturner, nor the street-bought packet of the underworld. Now, it wore a crisp, white lab coat, sanctioned by medical authority, purified by science, and delivered with a persuasive smile. You might find a quiet, dark humor in the thought. Now, addiction comes with a safety seal, a testament to the enduring human tendency to believe in the benevolent power of medicine. Even when history whispers cautionary tales, the quiet hum of pharmaceutical industry now seemed to promise ultimate relief. Yet beneath it, the familiar, unsettling thrum of impending crisis began to stir once more. The promising hum of the pharmaceutical renaissance, heralded by OxyContin, soon gave way to a discordant, desperate clamor. You feel the escalating tension, the rapid descent from prescribed relief to urgent, consuming desperation, as the true nature of this safe opioid began to unravel. The insidious reality of OxyContin, despite its time-release mechanism, was that its potent core could be unleashed with simple manipulation. Users, seeking a more immediate and intense effect, learned to crush the pills, bypassing the protective coating and unleashing a flood of opioid into their systems, mirroring the rapid onset of an intravenous injection. As the allure of this powerful high spread, so did the demand, driving street prices for OxyContin pills sky high. Imagine the frantic search for pills, the escalating cost, and the predictable consequence: pharmacies became targets, robbed by individuals desperate to feed their burgeoning habits. The quiet trust in medicine evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of addiction-fueled crime. Purdue Pharma, confronted with this growing crisis, steadfastly blamed the abusers, not the chemistry. They argued that the problem lay with those who misused the drug, rather than in the drug's inherent addictive properties or their aggressive marketing. You hear the carefully crafted corporate statements, the deflection of responsibility, as they clung to the narrative of a safe drug misused by a few bad actors. They even promoted the concept of pseudo-addiction, suggesting that patients exhibiting signs of addiction were merely undertreated for their pain, and thus should be given mortios dolam south desmia pills. A chilling, self-serving logic that poured fuel on an already raging fire. Rural America, particularly regions like Appalachia, became tragically emblematic of this crisis. You visualize the small towns, once struggling with economic hardship, now drowning in a flood of orange prescription bottles. Entire communities found themselves entangled, their lives reshaped by the easy availability and potent grip of OxyContin. Addiction now came with an insurance plan, cloaked in the legitimacy of a doctor's visit and a pharmacy receipt. Politicians, witnessing the devastating impact, belatedly recognized the scale of the problem. They began to call it a crisis, acknowledging its systemic nature, but still hesitating to fully categorize it as a crime in the same vein as illicit street drugs. You perceive the nuanced, often contradictory language, attempting to navigate the complexities of pharmaceutical responsibility versus individual culpability. Doctors, suddenly realizing the extent of the disaster they had inadvertently helped create, panicked. In a swift, dramatic overcorrection, they began to cut off prescriptions overnight, leaving millions of individuals genuinely dependent, without access to their accustomed relief. This abrupt cessation, you understand, created a profound and dangerous vacuum. A vast population, physically dependent and psychologically craving, was left with nowhere to turn, and into that gaping void, rapidly and relentlessly, heroin rushed back in. The cycle, once again, was complete. The quiet hope of the pharmaceutical cure had merely paved a new, more accessible path back to the very substance it was meant to supplant. The hum of the pharmacy, once promising relief, now echoed with the desperate silence of withdrawal and the rising tide of a familiar, deadly whisper. The sudden and widespread cutoff of prescription opioids created an immediate, profound chasm in the lives of millions, a vacuum that history, in its relentless repetition, had already shown how to fill. You feel the grim inevitability of this turn, as the promise of pharmaceutical safety disintegrated into an urgent, desperate search for relief. By the late 2000s, heroin, the familiar villain, had completed its tragic circle, returning with a vengeance. The reason for its resurgence was simple, and brutal. Heroin was now cheaper than the street price of the pills that had suddenly become inaccessible. Imagine the swift calculations made in moments of profound craving. The cold logic of economics driving individuals from the relative safety of a pill to the illicit, cheaper alternative. Cartels, always adaptive and opportunistic, quickly filled the void, recognizing the immense, unmet demand. But this time, they introduced a new, far more lethal element into the mix: synthetic fentanyl. Fentanyl, an opioid exponentially more potent than heroin itself, often mixed in with or masquerading as heroin, proved devastating. You hear the alarming statistics, the sheer scale of overdose deaths exploding across the Midwest, and then across the entire nation. Addicts, already struggling with the transition from pills, moved from clinics to morgues with terrifying speed. The familiar ghost of the poppy had evolved, its chemistry now far outpacing compassion, its reach more deadly than ever before. You feel the profound sadness, the helplessness, as communities were ravaged by this invisible, chemical storm. This new wave of victims defied previous stereotypes. They were not just the marginalized or the long-term street users. They were suburban teens experimenting for the first time, veterans grappling with chronic pain and trauma, mothers who had started with a legitimate prescription, each, in their own way, had thought they were finding medicine, a safe passage through suffering. Each, you realize, became a piece of history, another tragic testament to humanity's unending struggle with pain and the deceptive allure of chemical escape. The drug, in its evolution from the ancient poppy to the modern synthetic, had completed its circular journey, from the sterile laboratory to the elegant bottle to the street corner, and finally, for too many, to the grave. You understand that this was not a new problem, but a stark, modern iteration of a very old one. The silent hum of desperation, once a quiet undertone, now resonates as a loud, mournful cry across the nation. A stark reminder of the enduring power of addiction and the devastating consequences of our relentless search for chemical peace. As the narrative of heroin's journey draws toward its close, you are left with a profound sense of circularity, a haunting echo of lessons unlearned. You perceive the patterns, repeating with a relentless rhythm across centuries and cultures, revealing a fundamental flaw in humanity's approach to pain and pleasure. Every era, it seems, in its earnest pursuit of progress, believed it had finally found a safe high, a benevolent chemical key to unlock relief without consequence. From the Sumerians' joy plant to Sir Turner's morphine, to Bayer's hero, and Purdue's OxyContin, each was hailed as a solution, only to reveal its own tragic shadow. Science, in its noble and relentless quest, chases purity, the purest compound, the most precise delivery, the most effective relief. Humanity, in its equally relentless but more vulnerable way, chases peace, a quiet mind, a tranquil body, a moment of forgetting. And in a cruel twist of fate, politics, with its own ambitions and imperatives, weaponizes both, turning the pursuit of health into a tool of control, and the yearning for peace into a battleground. You feel the complex interplay of these forces, shaping the destinies of countless lives. Pain, you observe, is relentlessly profitable. Whether through the ancient trade of raw opium or the modern pharmaceutical industry, suffering has a price, and there are always those willing to capitalize on it. And memory, you realize, is tragically short. We forget the lessons of one generation, allowing the same mistakes to be repackaged and represented to the next, convinced this time it will be different. Empires, both literal and metaphorical, rise on the promise of chemistry, only to fall on the cold, hard ground of denial. The initial triumph of discovery is often overshadowed by the later refusal to acknowledge the consequences. You might visualize every poppy field blooming across the globe as a mirror reflecting our own human ambition, our desire to control, to escape, to create a perfect world. Even if that perfection is chemically induced, every addict, you understand, is not a sinner, but a symptom, a manifestation of deeper societal wounds, unaddressed pain, and a desperate search for belonging or oblivion. Yet, in our haste, we perpetually treat the symptoms, medicating the surface wounds, while largely ignoring the deeper, festering ailments of the soul and society. You might even find a reflective, almost resigned humor in our collective predicament. We never quit, we just rebrand withdrawal. The fundamental experience of addiction, the profound human response to craving and dependence, remains constant, even as its manifestations and the language we use to describe it evolve. This persistence speaks to a fundamental human vulnerability, a persistent yearning that transcends specific substances or eras. The quiet hum of history, in its endless repetition, seems to whisper this profound, enduring truth. Our long journey through the history of heroin now brings us full circle, back to where it all began, and yet profoundly changed. You stand at the precipice of understanding, watching the entire narrative unfold, a testament to humanity's enduring struggle. The same milky sap that once comforted ancient kings, gently soothing their passage to the long sleep, now, in its myriad transformed forms, tragically kills children, teenagers, and adults alike, across all walks of life. The threads of history are woven tightly, revealing the profound continuity of our human condition. The poppy, the source of it all, remains eternal and indifferent. You might envision its delicate petals unfurling under the sun, its pods swelling with sap, oblivious to the human drama it has inspired. It simply blooms, year after year, a silent, beautiful constant in a world of profound change. Humanity, in its anguish and confusion, calls this plant a curse, blaming its existence for our suffering. But in truth, you realize, the poppy was always a mirror reflecting our own desires, our weaknesses, our relentless search for peace. Addiction, then, is not merely chemical. It is, in its deepest essence, existential. It speaks to a fundamental human craving, not just for pleasure, but for silence, a quiet in the mind, a stillness in the soul that the world rarely provides. The sleep we seek, you understand, is not merely rest for weary bodies, but an escape from the relentless demands of existence, a temporary oblivion from consciousness itself. This longing for transcendence, for an exit from suffering, is deeply woven into our fabric. And so, history repeats its tragic, beautiful, and profoundly human narrative. It repeats, you ponder, because pain never truly ends. It merely changes its form, its source, its target. It is an inescapable companion to the human condition, and our response to it, our desperate, often misguided, but always understandable search for relief, continues to write new chapters in this ancient story. You feel the narrative gently fading now, like the last embers of a campfire on a cool night. And perhaps, as the light softens, you might hear a final, lingering whisper in the quiet air. The real miracle wasn't heroin, it was hope. The enduring, persistent, fragile hope that against all odds, we might one day find a true and lasting peace, a solace that does not demand so high a price. If these stories keep you awake, if they stir something within you, then please subscribe, drift, and remember, every empire of relief ends the same.